teachers of Reddit. What are some signs that a student is being abused or lives in a toxic environment? Regression. I'm a speech therapist who works with inner-city elementary children, where we see a lot of poverty, as well as drug abuse and etc. I had one case in particular that really stood out. I saw a little girl 7 years old who'd been delayed on her language skills. We knew she had a very difficult upbringing since she was the product of assault. She lived only with her mother, who impressively kept the two events, the assault and the birth of her daughter, as separated as possible. The assaulter, who I refuse to call a father, has served jail time in the past, but was released at this point on house arrest. He had no rights to see her, but the assaulter's parents, technically the child's grandparents, went to court and demanded rights to see their granddaughter. They refused to ever believe their son was an assaulter. Some judge, who I hope thinks of this case often, allowed it, as long as the father was not present. It started as supervised visits and eventually turned into visitation without supervision. Mom fought as hard as she could, but she couldn't afford a lawyer like the grandparents could. Mom had to drop her daughter off to the parents of her assaulter every other weekend for one night. I don't know how she did it. Anyway, I started to see a huge regression in her language skills. Her mean length of utterance decreased. She couldn't logically organize her thoughts into sentences, she couldn't categorize anymore, and so forth. Academically, when I spoke to the teacher, she said the same thing, but it really came to a head when she started to regress in other non-school related skills. One day, she wet her pants in my classroom and she just lost it. She was crying, she destroyed my room, she was hitting and punching to the point where I had to restrain her from hurting herself. Finally, when she calmed down, I brought her down to the nurse, got her a change of pants. But this girl was not only potty trained since I'd known her, she was known for being sweet, polite, and just slow to warm up. She was not a child to have outbursts like this. She wasn't sick, and I felt like I really needed to say something outside the school. Long story short, grandparents were sneaking over to the father's house so that her father could see and help raise his daughter. Turns out he started inappropriately touching her in the bathroom, during tub time, at the kitchen table, watching TV, basically any chance he could get when the grandparents walked out of the room for any amount of time. My heart broke for the mom. I'll never forget her telling us about how she couldn't live with herself knowing the fact that the man who assaulted her also touched her daughter. Anyway, you can probably imagine all the hurt and heartbreak the mother felt. Story 2. 9 to 12 teacher. Only 3 times have I had to call the abuse hotline. Twice I noticed at lunch duty. In one case, a kid was bringing a lunch consistently that would consist of stuff like a single piece of bread and a container of pop. But not even a real container like a can or a bottle. It was like a Tupperware container. Other case, a girl went from typical happy teenager to choosing to sit by herself in the corner and not talk to anyone. I asked one of her former friends she would sit with, a girl who was previously in my class whom I had a good relationship with, if something was up, what had happened, or whatever. She got super upset and said all the girl would say is that her stepdad was back living with them. I took that one to guidance, and they ultimately had me call along with them to voice our concern. Third one was a neglect issue. Kid would show up filthy, starving. I keep granola bars, etc. in a cabinet in case a kid is hungry / didn't have a lunch, and this kid would clean me out. And not in a teenager, craphead, I just want snacks man kind of way, but a super apologetic way. Thing is, I never heard back from CPS on any of them, with the exception being the girl with her stepdad back. And even that I just had to give a statement to police. It's weird that they never fill you in. It is weird that they don't fill you in, but it's still very important that you brought these things to people's attention, OP. You definitely are a hero in the school system, so props to you. Also, probably not going to be doing many voices for this one. This topic's a bit heavier, want to keep respectful, all that. Story 3. Band teacher here. A lot of times when teaching kids in beginning band how to play their instruments early on, you have to touch various body parts. Hands, of course, arms, hips, and shoulders for getting them into proper posture alignment. I always ask before I touch anywhere, is it okay if I touch your blank? Almost all kids say yes. I've had 2 that have said no. One was a student with autism and did not want to be touched. The other, turns out, was being abused at home. It's not a guarantee, of course, but often a sign. Story 4. Many kids who are verbally abused will do the same thing to peers they think less of or to younger kids. If a kid is calling someone horrible things, often things that kids should not be saying, like swear words or violent threats, for a minor offense like being annoying, they learned that. You can tell the difference between learning it from an adult and repeating something they heard on TV because they will genuinely, really mean it, and you can hear it in their voice. Quoting something they heard on TV doesn't usually have a context the way genuine rage does. Honestly, a kid who's just enraged all the time is a huge red flag for me, especially if they're under, 10. Story 5. I had a terrible experience as a student who was abused at home. At one point, I had a black eye every month or so. Once I had to do PE in shorts, and I had a huge black spot on my inner thighs which spread from the genitalia almost to the knee. I always told people I fell from my bike. I broke into crying out of nowhere regularly. My grades were awful and I had to repeat one entire year. I was a teenager and actually asked for help to the school counselor, which, after listening to me, said, "Since your younger sister is involved, we'd have to act and call the police. If you don't want to, we can just pretend we didn't have this talk." I was so scared, so nothing actually happened. She left me with a bunch of sort of propaganda pamphlets. She was into politics in my school town, asking me to give them to random people. Teachers kept on treating me like a rebellious teenager with behavioral problems, even though they made many talks about speaking up to the teacher if we had problems at home or we were being abused. This was Milan, Italy, 5 to 10 years ago. Now, I can usually recognize anyone who had been beaten or abused at home when they were kids in a short conversation. Story 6. My perspective is high school, grades 7 to 12. Difference in how they treat male and female teachers. I've had quite a few students who I can tell have pretty toxic fathers because they project their issues onto me as a male teacher. Overly sensitive kids. No healthy environment produces a kid who's extremely emotionally unstable in high school. There will be a toxic or abusive environment somewhere in their life. Bullying, home life, or otherwise. Off comments that slip out because the kid feels it's somewhat normal, but it's way off what's normal. Like, "Don't worry, sir, it's just that I got 8 hours of sleep last week." The content of their art that they doodle in the margins. How they deal with other kids' hyperaggression or power plays are red flags. How they deal with the knowing they've got an answer wrong. Those who are from toxic environments can be very fearful of retribution for any imperfection from them, doing things just for the sake of being in control of that thing. I have a student who shaves their eyebrows off, and another who will purposefully be a few minutes late to every one of my classes. I caught them on time once by accident and they walked right out to come back in a few minutes later, so they were late. Story 7. Swedish teacher here in Sweden. My mom was a principal for almost 30 years at a school for kids aged 6 to 12, so she had seen some bad stuff during her years. She didn't tell me everything because of a non-disclosure agreement on her part, but she did tell me some things. One such thing was a young girl from Somalia. She and her parents went back to Somalia on vacation, and when they got back, the girl told one of the staffers that she had been cut with scissors down there. Now, female genital mutilation is quite common in Somalia and Eastern Africa, and extremely illegal in Sweden. So the law forces you to call Child Protective Services if you even suspect something's afoot. So the staffer did, and CPS and police show up, place the girl in protective custody, and the parents are arrested and held. The girl goes to a hospital and is examined, and it turns out the whole thing was a lie. The parents are furious and remove their kid from that school and threaten legal action. As far as I know, nothing came of it. I gotta say, I do much prefer these things be taken seriously like that as opposed to dismissed. Like, sure, there's a chance they're lying, but the odds that a kid lies about something like that are actually pretty low. It's kind of confusing where she would even pick that kind of thing up from. Story 8. Not a teacher, but I worked with kids in a restorative justice program, basically community service. And there would be kids who have so many hours they would come in after school and weekends for months. We had some kids who would do something petty and stupid literally weeks before they were done, despite being fairly successful in the program. It was because coming in every day and having staff ask about their life, make sure they had lunch every day, and give some structure to their lives was something they craved and didn't have at home. They would self-sabotage in order to keep it. It was sad. Imagine how bad your home life has to be to choose to do court-ordered manual labor rather than be at home. Story 9. State of hygiene. Are they washed, hairbrushed, clothes clean, and different from day to day? This has to somewhat be taken into context with the environment of the neighborhood, but even families who don't have many clothes will not want their children seen in dirty clothes at school. Kids don't like their hair brushed typically, but if continuously tangled, even matted, it would and has raised my interests. Marks in places that can't be explained. Consistency in unexplained bruises or red marks. Many children who are intimately abused will deal with it by showing inappropriate love/affection towards their abuser or teachers who are in line with their abuser, trying to always sit in their lap, hug them, kiss them, but it has a different feel than the hugging most kids show. Just like it can feel different watching two adults hug if they're friends or partners. They also tend to play with concepts that they should know nothing about when it comes to intimate activity. Listen to what they say. I work with young children. They talk about everything if given the chance by a trusted adult and not pushed. If you are truly interested, there are child abuse recognition/prevention trainings available, if in the US at least, and I'm sure in other countries too. Story 10. Not exactly a teacher, but a former daycare and after-school care worker here. I had a child for years who came in clothes that were old and too small. Her shoes would be falling apart, and she'd often ask us for tape to put them back together. I was always suspicious of this, but the other staff would just say, "Oh, they don't have money," so I tried to let it slide even though I knew it wasn't really true. And clothes for a 12-year-old are not that expensive, especially when we had a lot of discount shops around. She would also come in smelling badly or her hair being greasy. After subtly talking about it and her telling me she just didn't like to shower, I found she wasn't allowed to shower often. As a child going through puberty, this was unacceptable to me, but again, other staff brushed off my concerns. One day she started talking about the bugs in her room, and I felt my intuition growing stronger about the situation. This was a clear case of neglect. There were little things here and there that made me suspicious as well, like stories of her grandfather stealing money from her and other little signs of it. After being concerned for a long time, the thing that broke it all for me was hearing how she was given old, moldy food for lunch. I called the DCF that night. A week later, she started coming in smelling fresh and wearing new, clean clothes and new shoes. I can't say what else changed at home, but seeing her confidence rise when she was finally clean was worth it to me. Story 11. It's pretty obvious, but I had a kid come in with a black eye. I didn't think anything of it at first. He was a very active child with a lot of energy, so I nonchalantly asked what happened. He instantly responded with, "I ran into a door." And the way he said it was so quick and forced that it sounded rehearsed. Any teacher is required to report suspicion of abuse, even if it may be nothing. Turns out, his moms were the worst kind of evil. Regularly beat him, made him sit in a closet for hours if he acted out, forced him to stand for hours holding water buckets, and if he stumbled, they would hit him more. Believe it or not, his baby sister, about 3, had it worse. Found out she was being inappropriately touched by the stepmom while her biological mother watched. Now that I'm looking back on it, I can realize something was wrong because she was so developmentally delayed when it came to speech. Thankfully, the pieces of crap that called themselves parents were arrested, and both children went on to live with their grandmother. But it's disgusting what happened to them. Anyway, TLDR answer to the question: unexplained bruises, rehearsed lines trying to explain them away, sometimes developmental delays in speech, drawings, not always, but sometimes kids express what they can't say through drawing. Edit. There seems to be a lot of confusion, so let me clear up some things. The biological father left the children, and the biological mother later married a woman. This is one instance of abuse originating from a same-sex couple, but in no way indicates that same-sex couples are inherently bad parents. Nor does it mean they shouldn't have children. I'm no longer their teacher and haven't seen them in 4-ish years, but last I heard, they were doing well. Grandmother isn't perfect, but they're safe and cared for. Story 12. Low self-esteem, being really down on themselves, unusual behavior towards adults or children of the opposite sex, including simulating intimate activity, unwillingness to change for PE lessons, stealing food, emotional outbursts, hiding details of their personal life, neglect such as persisting medical conditions such as nits, bad teeth, or eczema that's clearly going untreated, clothing that's too small or unwashed. Some of this can be down to poverty, but it's one factor in a range that is always worth having in your mind. Honestly, there's so much I can't even think of all the things. It's about knowing your pupils and establishing what's normal for them and their personality and what's indicative of a larger issue. Story 13. There are loads of signs to look out for, some of which can just be normal teenage behaviors, but communication is key, as all these small things can create a big picture of abuse. There are 4 categories of abuse. Physical abuse, injuries in non-accidental areas, forearms, legs, soles of feet, as opposed to accidental injuries such as knees and hands caused by kids falling over, playing sports, or whatever. These injuries often are picked up by the PE department. In academic subjects, though, this can be presented by students refusing to take off their blazer, for example, during a science practical, flinching in response to people coming close to them, aggression towards other students, neglect, students complaining of hunger. For example, I had a student tell me that all the food they had for the day was a lollipop. Students not wanting to go home at the end of the day. Poor hygiene, dirty clothes. A particularly difficult one to approach with parents. Sleeping in lessons. Intimate abuse. Hyper-intimate language for students of their age. Constant readjusting of genital area. Particularly adverse reactions to teachers of a specific gender. Emotional abuse. Dramatic change in a child's behavior, be it becoming more outlandish or more reserved. Low self-esteem, constantly playing down their ability. Bullying other students to deflect their own insecurities. Again, some of these could be one-off incidents to the teacher. However, everything must be reported so a big picture can be formed. And I must say, I've seen an increase in safeguarding incidences during the pandemic, which is truly hard to see. Luckily, we have professional footballers who will work to look after our most vulnerable, while the UK government actively vote against them. Story 14. I'm not a teacher, but I can give you the answer from the abused child's perspective. Me and my siblings grew up in an extremely violent, abusive household, and we each reacted differently. We were also intimately abused by a male family member. I was extremely sensitive and withdrawn as a child. At elementary school, I struggled to form friendships and kept to myself. I would often hide in the restroom during recess as I had a fear of interacting with others. I would cry a lot, especially if I made a mistake at school. I was labeled as shy, but in fact, I was just terrified of the world and traumatized. One of my sisters, on the other hand, was pegged as a problem child and a bully. as she was aggressive to other children and struggled with authority. She had frequent angry outbursts at school and was unable to regulate her emotions. She would swear at other students and teachers and use inappropriate adult language. She would also expose herself and was overly intimate, talking about things that no child should know about. She started self-harming at the age of 10, which is when a teacher noticed and the relevant authorities were informed. Up until that point, no one had intervened, even though with hindsight it was so clear something awful had been going on behind closed doors. One thing to note with physical abuse is that abusers are often calculated, and will hit a child in an area where bruises are not easily detectable / can be kept covered. We were always hit in the torso or the back of the head. Hindsight really does make these things a lot easier to see. I'm sure the school system sees a lot of problem children go through without any real root cause, or super bad root cause at least. So I can understand why some of these would get brushed off. But as one of the other OPs wrote, reporting every incident is important because it helps build a bigger picture. And that bigger picture can sometimes be something like this. OP, I hope you're doing better now at the very least. That kind of early environment is hard to bounce back from. Story 15. Early childhood and primary school teacher, directly from experience. 1. A school with a uniform required all girls to wear dresses. However, one girl, Emma, refused to hem hers up. She wanted hers ankle length and could not be talked out of it no matter how much she was made fun of. 2. Same girl ran around in circles saying, "Coke makes me drunk," and acted as though she was passing out. A little performance to her peers aged 6 at the time. Her mother brought it to the teacher's attention because she never gave Emma Coke. 3. She began puberty prior to 10 years old. 4. She would wake from nightmares and have these screaming headaches. 5. Came home with underwear that wasn't hers. 6. Last one. She one day hit a man who was walking through the primary school. Turns out this man, the local priest of the Catholic primary school, was taking Emma out of class to do odd jobs. Teachers never questioned it at the time. Turns out he was taking her to the school hall, a tiny room near the stage, locking the door, showering with her, and assaulting her, all whilst giving her Coke laced with a drug that made her pass out. He assaulted her from the ages of 5 to 8 and did it to her sister too. She ended her own life years later. Story 16. It's been a few years, but I had an incident/situation that stuck with me. My students were working on something, probably solving density equations, and one guy came up to ask for help. I was standing near my whiteboard but had left my favorite expo marker on the cart that held my projector/laptop. So I reached around him to grab the marker and show him on the board how to figure out the problem. Hey, if one kid is struggling with a problem, there's usually several more that haven't asked. Anyway, when I reached, he flinched hard. Arms over his head, eyes tight shut, as if he just knew I was going to hurt him. I kept him after class and we talked. Lots of tears, not just his. He showed me bruises on his back. I notified my principal that I would need someone to cover my next class and called DCS, what most states call CPS. He was placed in a foster home and his father was arrested. He missed a few days and came back. He wasn't instantly better, which would make for a better story, but by the end of the school year, I could see he was a little more confident and a little happier. This was around 10 years ago now. I often wonder what happened to him. Story 17. Former abused kid, and I have some signs that you probably wouldn't think of. Homework not being done or permission slips not being signed. Because kid is afraid to ask, parents won't check, or kid doesn't have time in between everything else. Hiding themselves behind art or storytelling. It might not even be graphic. Just, could you imagine somewhere far away from here and safe? Or characters with dark backstories. Falling asleep in class. Not dressing for the weather. Shorts in winter or long sleeves in summer. Lying for attention or to save face. Example, I lied that my dad was in the army growing up rather than admit that I hadn't seen him in years due to his drug addiction. And that is all the stories we have for today. This one was definitely heavier subject matter for sure. So I'd encourage just taking some time to chill out and, let it process or just have some good vibes. I don't know. Just whatever you need right now. That being said, I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.